Chapter 1. The Mirror That Measured More Than Beauty. The queen did not ask the mirror if she was beautiful. That was the first lie people told about her. Beauty was obvious. It required no confirmation, no ritual, no question repeated at dawn and dusk. The queen knew exactly what she looked like. She had known since the first day servants learned to lower their eyes when she passed, since the first courtier forgot his words mid-sentence, since the first seamstress trembled while fastening her gown. No, what the queen asked the mirror was something else entirely. She stood before it now, wrapped in a robe of dark velvet. The winter light filtered thin and pale through tall windows behind her. Snow pressed against the glass outside, blurring the world into a white hush. The castle was quiet at this hour. It always was. She had trained it to be. The mirror hung from the stone wall like a living thing, its frame twisted from black and silver, its surface unnaturally still. It did not reflect the room as ordinary glass would. It waited. The queen folded her hands. "Tell me," she said calmly, "who is the most obedient in the land?" The mirror stirred. Its surface rippled, darkening, as though depth opened where reflection should be. When it spoke, its voice was low and measured, neither male nor female, neither kind nor cruel. "You are," it answered, "as you have always been." The queen allowed herself a small breath of satisfaction. Obedience was order. Order was peace. Peace was control. Beauty, after all, faded. Snow White had learned that early. She sat by the narrow window in her chamber, watching snow gather silently on the stone ledge outside. The flakes drifted downward in careful spirals, settling without sound, layering the world until sharp edges softened into gentleness. She liked winter best. In winter, nothing expected you to bloom. Snow White rested her chin in her palm, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. The servants had not yet come to braid it for the day. She preferred it this way, unarranged, unmeasured. She listened, not for footsteps, not for voices, for the castle itself. Snow White had grown up learning how to listen between sounds. She listened to the spaces where conversations stopped too quickly, to the pauses where servants chose their words carefully, to the silence that followed the queen's footsteps long after they faded down the hall. The castle breathed in patterns. She had memorized them. Today, the pattern was tense. Snow White stood slowly, smoothing her simple gown. She did not wear colors often. Brightness drew attention. Attention drew notice. Notice brought questions. And questions were dangerous. A soft knock came at her door, precise, polite. "Your Highness," a maid said quietly, "the queen requests your presence." Snow White closed her eyes briefly. Of course she did. The queen always did, eventually. Snow White walked the long corridors without haste, her steps measured, her gaze lowered just enough to be respectful but not submissive. She passed guards who did not look at her directly. She passed tapestries depicting hunts, coronations, triumphs frozen in thread. All victories of watching. The queen awaited her in the solar, standing before the mirror once more. She did not turn as Snow White entered. "Come closer," the queen said. Snow White obeyed. She stopped where she always did, far enough not to intrude, close enough not to seem distant. The mirror's surface shifted slightly as Snow White entered its range. Snow White felt it then. The familiar pressure. Not fear. Tension. The queen studied the mirror, not Snow White. "Tell me," she said softly, "what do you see?" The mirror hesitated, a fraction longer than usual. Snow White's pulse quickened. "I see a girl," the mirror said slowly, "who does not look when she is watched." The queen's fingers tightened slightly on her robe. Snow White kept her gaze fixed on the floor. "And what does that mean?" the queen asked. The mirror's surface darkened further. "It means she has learned something you once knew." The queen turned sharply. Snow White did not flinch. "Look at me," the queen commanded. Snow White raised her eyes. The queen searched her face, not for beauty, not for youth, but for resistance, for defiance, for the subtle tremor of a thought unguarded. She found none. Snow White's expression was calm, open, careful. A face trained not to betray its owner. "Do you know why the mirror speaks to me?" the queen asked. Snow White answered truthfully, "Because it tells you what others hide." The queen smiled thinly. "No," she said, "because it tells me who obeys." Snow White inclined her head. The queen stepped closer. "And do you obey me?" Snow White's voice was soft. "I obey the rules." The queen studied her closely, displeased by the distinction. "Rules can be bent," she said. "People cannot." Snow White did not respond. The mirror rippled again. The queen turned back to it. "Tell me," she said, her voice sharp now, "who will replace me?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Snow White felt a strange calm settle over her. She already knew the answer. The mirror spoke. "There is a girl," it said, "who cannot be measured." The queen's breath hitched. "Name her." The mirror's voice lowered. "She does not look when she is watched. She does not answer when she is measured. She does not compete." Snow White's heart beat once. "Steady." The queen turned slowly. She said. Snow White met her gaze. "No," Snow White said quietly. The queen's eyes narrowed. "You dare." "I do not compete," Snow White repeated gently. "I do not ask the mirror questions. I do not measure myself." The queen laughed sharply. "That is exactly the danger." Snow White felt it then, the shift. The moment the air in the room changed from inquiry to decision. The queen stepped back, her posture rigid, controlled. "Leave," she said coldly. "Go to the forest. Clear your thoughts." Snow White bowed. She turned and walked away without haste, her pulse steady. She did not see the mirror's surface ripple again as she left. But if she had, she might have noticed something new. Not envy, not anger, recognition. And for the first time since Snow White was born, the mirror did not tell the queen what she wanted to hear. Chapter 2: The Forest That Learned Her Name. Snow White entered the forest without looking back. That, too, was something she had learned early. The castle only held power when you acknowledged it. Walls could watch. Windows could remember. Even the mirror's gaze weakened when it was denied a final glance. The forest received her quietly. Snow muffled her footsteps almost immediately, the ground yielding softly beneath her boots. The trees stood close together here, their branches heavy with white, bending but never breaking. Light filtered through in pale fragments, scattering rather than illuminating, as if the forest preferred suggestion over clarity. Snow White slowed her pace deliberately. She did not rush. Rushing was a kind of fear, and fear was loud. She moved the way animals did, steady, aware, conserving warmth and breath. Her cloak brushed against bark and low branches, collecting snow along its hem. Each step carried her farther from the castle's measured silences and deeper into a different kind of quiet. This silence listened back. She felt it almost immediately, the sense of being noticed without being judged. The forest did not measure her posture or her expression. It did not ask who she was meant to become. It simply registered her presence, the way one registers weather. Snow White exhaled slowly. For the first time in days, perhaps longer, her shoulders loosened. She followed no marked path. Paths implied expectation. Instead, she let her steps be guided by instinct and subtle shifts in the terrain. When the ground dipped, she slowed. When the trees thinned, she paused and listened. The forest had a rhythm, not the rigid rhythm of bells and schedules, but a living one, branches creaking softly, snow sliding from needles, distant birds stirring and settling again. It was a rhythm that made space for rest. Snow White had almost forgotten such things existed. She walked until the cold began to creep through her boots and into her bones. Hunger followed, dull and familiar. Not the sharp, panicked hunger of sudden lack, but the steady reminder of a body that needed tending. She found shelter beneath a thick fir, its branches forming a low canopy that blocked falling snow. There, she sat and unwrapped the small bundle she had brought from the castle. A heel of bread, a slice of apple wrapped carefully in cloth. She ate slowly. Each bite mattered. Each bite was chosen. When she finished, she brushed the crumbs into the snow, then leaned back against the trunk and closed her eyes. Sleep came quickly. Not the heavy sleep enforced by exhaustion or fear, but something lighter, woven with awareness. She dreamed of falling snow that never reached the ground, of mirrors clouded over, of a voice calling her name and stopping just short of command. When she woke, the light had shifted. Dusk gathered early in winter, softening the forest into shades of blue and gray. Snow White stood, stretching slowly, testing her limbs. The cold had sharpened, but it felt honest. She began walking again. It was then that she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. A presence. Snow White stopped, every instinct quieting at once. She did not turn. She did not flee. She simply listened with her whole body, the way she had learned to listen in the castle corridors. Something moved among the trees. Not stalking. Watching. Snow White spoke softly, her voice barely more than breath. "I know you're there." The forest held its silence. Then, slowly, shapes emerged from the trees. 7 figures. They did not appear all at once. One stepped forward, then another, until they stood in a loose semicircle several paces away. They were bundled in mismatched coats and cloaks, their faces weathered, their eyes alert. Snow clung to their beards and brows. They were not threatening, but they were wary. "You're far from the road," said one at last. His voice was rough and used to conversation. "People who come here usually don't mean to." Snow White inclined her head slightly. "I meant to." Another figure crossed his arms. "Running from something?" Snow White considered the question carefully. "Walking away," she said. "There's a difference." The men exchanged glances. The first speaker studied her more closely now, not her face, but her posture, her stillness. "You don't move like someone lost," he said slowly. Snow White allowed herself a faint smile. "I've had practice not being seen." That, surprisingly, earned a quiet laugh from one of them. They introduced themselves simply, without ceremony. Names that sounded more like functions than identities. Watcher, Smith, Keeper, Cutter. Men who had learned long ago that names carried weight and weight attracted attention. They lived deeper in the forest, they explained, where the trees grew denser and the castle's reach weakened. They did not ask her name. That, Snow White noticed, was a kind of kindness. She followed them as the light faded completely, the forest guiding them along narrow trails only they seemed to see. Eventually, they reached a clearing where smoke rose thinly into the night air. A low structure stood there, built from stone and timber, half buried into the earth for warmth. Light glowed from its small windows, not bright, but steady. Inside it was warm. Not indulgently so. Not enough to dull the senses. Just enough to survive. Snow White stood near the doorway, waiting for instruction that did not come. "You can sit," one of them said finally. Or not. She sat. A bowl of stew was placed in her hands without comment. It was thick and plain, heavy with root vegetables. She ate slowly, savoring the simplicity. After a time, one of the men spoke again. "You know," he said, staring into the fire, "the Queen's been restless." Snow White did not react. "They say the mirror's been difficult," another added. Snow White felt a faint tightening in her chest, but she kept her gaze steady. "Mirrors are only difficult when they stop reflecting what you expect," she said quietly. The men looked at her then, not with suspicion, but understanding. "You're the girl," one said softly. Snow White met his gaze. "I'm a girl," she corrected, "not a replacement." Silence settled again, comfortable this time. Outside, the forest shifted gently under falling snow. Inside, the fire burned without hunger. Snow White felt something unfamiliar settle over her. Not safety exactly, but possibility. The Queen could watch the castle. The mirror could measure obedience. But here, among trees that listened and people who did not ask to be seen, Snow White felt something dangerous growing quietly within her. Not ambition, not rebellion, something steadier, a self that did not need to be measured to exist. And somewhere far behind her, in a room of stone and silver, the mirror waited, uneasy now for the first time, aware that the girl it could not measure had stepped into a place where watching no longer mattered. Chapter 3: The Weight of Being Unseen. Snow White learned quickly that the forest did not rush. Morning arrived without announcement, light filtering slowly through the trees until the edges of the world softened into visibility. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, still warm enough to touch, still alive enough to coax back into flame. One of the men, she thought, knelt nearby, adding a single piece of wood with care. No one spoke at first. Silence here was not absence. It was agreement. Snow White sat up on the narrow pallet she had been given, the wool blanket heavy but not smothering. Her body felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. She was cold at the edges, but alert, awake in a way she rarely had been inside the castle. She stood quietly, not wishing to disturb the balance of the room. Smith noticed her first. He nodded once in greeting and returned to sharpening a blade. Not a weapon, she realized, but a tool. Everything here had a purpose that did not require explanation. "You slept," he said. Snow White inclined her head. "Yes." "Good," he replied. "The forest doesn't like people who don't rest." She smiled faintly at that. They moved through the morning with practiced rhythm. One went out to check traps. Another split wood. Keeper tended to the fire and the stores with an attentiveness that suggested scarcity was remembered, not feared. Snow White offered to help. They did not refuse, but they did not instruct her either. She learned by watching. She learned where to step so branches would not snap. How to pour water without spilling heat from the pot. How to move without drawing attention, a skill she already possessed, now finding new use. As the day unfolded, she realized something unsettling. No one here watched her the way the Queen did. They noticed her, yes, but without expectation, without anticipation of failure or excellence. She was neither threat nor promise. She was simply present. That absence of pressure weighed on her more heavily than scrutiny ever had. In the castle, every movement had been calculated, each silence interpreted. Here, her silences passed without comment, and she found herself uncertain what to do with that freedom. By midday, snow fell again, slow and thick. The forest accepted it without change. Snow White stepped outside, breathing deeply, letting cold air fill her lungs. She thought of the mirror. Not its voice, but its attention. She imagined it now, clouded, restless, unable to settle on a reflection that made sense. For the first time, the queen could not measure the thing she feared. That thought brought no triumph, only caution. Snow White knew better than to assume being unseen meant being safe. The queen's power did not depend on proximity. It depended on knowing where to look. She returned inside as the men gathered near the hearth once more. A map lay spread across the table, not a map of roads or borders, but of terrain. Trees marked not by name, but by age. Streams traced not for crossing, but for sound. This forest, Watcher said, noticing her gaze, remembers. Snow White tilted her head. What does it remember? Who walks through it often, he replied. And who walks through it once? She felt a quiet chill. So it remembers me, she said. Yes, he answered, but not the way the mirror would. That night, as darkness closed in early, they ate together again. The meal was simple, nourishing. No abundance, no ceremony. Snow White felt hunger fully now, not as panic, but as truth. She ate without guilt, without gratitude expected in return. Afterward, Cutter spoke for the first time since her arrival. His voice was low, steady. You should know, he said, people come looking. Snow White's hand stilled. For me. For anyone who disappears, he replied. The queen does not like unanswered questions. Snow White nodded slowly. She won't come herself. No, Keeper said. She'll send eyes. Snow White felt the old instinct rise, the need to vanish, to become smaller, quieter, forgettable. But something resisted. I won't run, she said. The men studied her carefully now. That's not bravery, Smith said. That's choosing where to stand. Snow White looked into the fire. I've spent my life being measured, she said softly. If I disappear now, I become exactly what she expects. Silence followed. Then Watcher nodded once. Then you'll need to learn how to stay without being taken. Snow White looked up. How? Watcher's gaze shifted to the trees beyond the walls. By letting the forest know you, he said, before the queen does. That night, Snow White did not dream. She lay awake, listening to the forest breathe around the shelter, the quiet pulse of something vast and patient. She felt herself slowly changing, not hardened, not emboldened, but grounded. The girl the mirror could not measure was learning something new. Being unseen was not enough. To survive, she would have to choose when to be found. And somewhere far away, in a chamber of stone and silver, the queen stood before a restless mirror, aware now that the forest had learned a name she could not erase. Chapter 4. The Eyes That Learned to Look Away. Snow White learned what it meant to stay. Not to hide, not to flee, but to remain without being claimed. The lesson began before dawn, when the forest was at its most deceptive. The world lay hushed beneath a thin veil of frost, every sound dampened, every shape softened. This was the hour, Watcher explained, when the queen's eyes were most active. Stillness attracts attention, he told Snow White quietly as they stood at the edge of the clearing. Too much silence feels deliberate. Snow White nodded. She understood that instinctively. In the castle, silence had always been suspicious. Silence meant plotting or fear or restraint barely held. So what do we do? She asked. Watcher bent and brushed a thin layer of snow from a fallen branch, snapping it cleanly in two. The sound echoed faintly through the trees. We remind the forest we're here, he said, without announcing why. They walked, not along paths, but through them, between trees, over low ridges, across frozen streams that cracked softly underfoot. Watcher moved with ease, his steps never hurried, never tentative. Snow White followed, adjusting her pace to his, learning when to step where he stepped and when to choose her own footing. They stopped often. To listen. To wait. Snow White learned that waiting did not mean stopping. It meant allowing the forest to settle around you, to accept your presence before you moved again. When she rushed, branches brushed her cloak loudly. When she slowed, the forest opened small spaces just wide enough to pass through. "You don't disappear," Watcher said once, as she paused beneath a cluster of pines. "You become familiar." Snow White repeated the words silently, letting them sink in. As the light grew, they reached a high rise overlooking a long stretch of forest. From there, the castle was barely visible, a dark suggestion against the pale horizon. Snow White stared at it longer than she meant to. Watcher did not interrupt. "She's watching," Snow White said finally. "Yes," he agreed. Snow White swallowed. "Can she see me?" Watcher considered. "Not clearly," he said. "Not yet." That should have brought relief. It didn't. The Queen's watching was not about sight alone. Snow White had felt it her whole life. The pressure of expectation, the sense of being weighed against something invisible. "Then what does she see?" Snow White asked. Watcher's voice was calm. "A disruption." Snow White nodded slowly. By midday, the men had gathered again near the shelter. Cutter and Smith returned from scouting with quiet expressions. Keeper adjusted the stores with deliberate care. "She's sent trackers," Cutter said at last. Snow White felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "How many?" "Enough," Smith replied. "They won't enter deep forest yet. Not without reason." Snow White exhaled slowly. "Then we give them none." Keeper studied her closely. "You understand?" he said. "If you leave, they'll follow. If you hide too well, they'll search harder." Snow White met his gaze. "Then I stay visible enough to be boring." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That afternoon, Snow White helped with tasks she was never meant to know. She learned how to mark trees in ways that meant nothing to outsiders. How to disturb snow just enough to confuse patterns. How to let signs exist without pointing anywhere. She was careful not to move like a fugitive. She moved like someone who belonged. As dusk fell, the forest shifted again. Snow White sensed it before she heard anything. The tightening of air, the subtle alertness in the men's movements. "They're closer," Watcher murmured. Snow White stood near the fire, hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her heart pounded, but she forced her breathing slow. "I won't run," she said quietly. Watcher nodded. "Good." From the edge of the clearing, figures appeared. Not soldiers. Observers. They wore muted cloaks, their faces indistinct in the fading light. They did not draw weapons. They did not speak. They watched. Snow White felt the old instinct surge, drop her gaze, make herself smaller, shrink beneath their attention. She did none of those things. She lifted her chin slightly, not defiantly, not submissively. She let her presence be simple. The observers lingered. One stepped forward slightly, scanning the clearing, the shelter, the men. His gaze paused on Snow White. Her breath caught, but she did not look away. She did not smile. She did not react. She existed. After a long moment, the observer stepped back. The figures retreated into the trees, their interest fading as quietly as it had arrived. Snow White exhaled only when they were gone. Watcher looked at her with something like approval. "You did well." Snow White's voice trembled despite her effort. "They saw me." "Yes," he said. "And they learned nothing." That night, Snow White sat alone outside the shelter, wrapped in her cloak, staring up at the narrow strip of sky visible through the branches. Snow fell again, light and patient. She thought of the mirror. She imagined it now, straining to reflect something that refused to align. An image present but unmeasurable. For the first time, She felt not hunted, but misunderstood. And misunderstanding, she realized, was the beginning of freedom. The queen could watch. The mirror could measure. But the forest had learned something the castle never would. Snow White was not running. She was staying. And that choice, quiet, deliberate, unyielding, was something the queen had never learned how to control. Chapter 5. The question the mirror could not answer. Snow White woke before the forest did. That too was new. In the castle, waking early had always felt like anticipation, anxiety dressed as diligence. Each morning carried the unspoken question of how she would be perceived, corrected, compared. Here, waking early felt different. It felt like readiness without urgency. The fire had burned low overnight, leaving the shelter wrapped in a thin, honest chill. Snow White pulled her cloak tighter and sat up slowly, careful not to wake the others. Outside, the forest lay suspended in that quiet moment before sound returned. No birds yet, no wind, only the faint settling of snow. She stepped outside alone. The air bit at her cheeks, sharp but clarifying. She welcomed it. Cold reminded her where she ended and the world began. It did not blur boundaries the way warmth sometimes did. She walked a short distance from the shelter and stopped beneath a bare-limbed tree whose branches reached upward like questions left unfinished. Snow White closed her eyes. She thought of the queen. Not with fear, but with clarity. The queen had not always been cruel. Snow White remembered that now, with uncomfortable honesty. There had been a time when the queen's gaze had been proud rather than sharp, when instruction had not yet hardened into surveillance. Something had changed. Something the mirror had encouraged. Snow White understood it now. The mirror did not reward beauty. It rewarded certainty. The queen returned to it again and again, not because she feared being replaced, but because she feared becoming unsure. The mirror offered answers when doubt appeared. Simple answers. Measurable answers. Snow White's breath fogged the air. What frightened the queen was not youth. It was ambiguity. Behind Snow White, snow crunched softly. Watcher approached without surprise, stopping several paces away. "You're thinking loudly," he said gently. Snow White smiled faintly. "I didn't know that was possible." "It is," he replied, "when you stop hiding." They stood together in silence for a moment. "She'll send more eyes," Watcher said eventually. "Not just watchers this time. Questioners." Snow White nodded. "They'll want certainty." "Yes," he agreed. "And certainty always demands an answer." Snow White's expression tightened. "I won't give them one." Watchers studied her carefully. "Then they'll try to give you one instead." The forest shifted around them, branches creaking faintly as if listening. "They'll want you to be something," Watcher continued. "A threat, a symbol, a challenge." Snow White looked up at the pale sky. "I'm none of those." Watcher's voice was calm but firm. "That won't stop them." Later that day, the forest tested her resolve. The questioners arrived at midday, when the light was clean and revealing. 3 of them emerged from the trees openly, their cloaks marked with the queen's sigil, subtle but unmistakable. They did not surround the clearing. They did not threaten. They approached as though they belonged. Snow White stood near the hearth, her posture relaxed. She did not retreat. One of the men inclined his head politely. "Princess." Snow White acknowledged him with a nod. "You're far from the castle." "So are you," he replied mildly. She did not correct him. "We came with questions," another said. Snow White met his gaze evenly. Questions are rarely just questions. A faint smile crossed his face. "Spoken like royalty." Watcher shifted slightly, but Snow White raised a hand, subtle, controlled. "I'll answer what I choose," Snow White said calmly. The men exchanged glances. "Do you intend to return?" the first asked. Snow White considered the question carefully, not for its meaning, but for its shape. It was not an invitation. It was a measurement. "I intend to remain," she said. "Here," the second pressed. "Where I am," Snow White replied. The third man stepped forward slightly. "The Queen worries," he said smoothly. "Absence creates uncertainty." Snow White's voice was quiet but firm. "Uncertainty is not harm." The men studied her now, their gazes sharper. "You are changing," the first observed. Snow White nodded. "Yes." "Into what?" he asked. Snow White did not answer. The silence stretched. Finally, the second man exhaled softly. "You see," he said to the others, "this is the problem." Snow White met his gaze. "No," she said. "This is the answer." The men withdrew without ceremony, their expressions unreadable. That night, Snow White sat alone by the fire again, turning the day over in her mind. She had not resisted. She had not submitted. She had refused to be defined. She realized then what the mirror could not understand. It could only reflect what stood still long enough to be captured. Snow White was no longer still. And somewhere, in a chamber of silver and stone, the Queen stood before a mirror that showed her something unfamiliar. Not a rival, not an enemy, but a question with no answer. And that, Snow White knew, was what would finally undo her. Chapter 6: The Girl Who Was No Longer Reflected. The Queen returned to the mirror alone. She dismissed the servants early that evening, sending them away with curt nods and a stillness that discouraged questions. The corridors emptied quickly. Candles were extinguished one by one until only the mirror chamber remained lit, the silvered surface glowing faintly in the dimness like a watchful eye that never closed. Outside, snow fell in thick, deliberate silence. The Queen stood before the mirror for a long time without speaking. She did not ask her question. That, more than anything, unsettled the mirror. At last, it stirred on its own. "You have not asked," it said, its voice low and careful. The Queen's reflection looked tired in the glass. Older, perhaps, than she remembered. Not less beautiful, beauty had never truly left her, but strained, as though something essential had been held too tightly for too long. "I no longer trust your answers," the Queen said quietly. The mirror rippled. "I have always told you the truth." "No," she replied. "You told me what could be measured." Silence fell between them. "Where is she?" the Queen demanded at last. The mirror hesitated. For the first time since it had been bound to this wall, it could not settle into a clear image. Shapes flickered, trees, snow, firelight, but none held. "She is present," the mirror said uncertainly. The Queen's fingers curled. "That is not an answer." "It is the only one left," the mirror replied. The Queen stepped closer, her voice sharp. "Show me." The mirror darkened further, searching, straining. It showed glimpses now, Snow White standing among trees, Snow White speaking without urgency, Snow White turning her face toward neither approval nor defiance. The Queen recoiled slightly. "That is not her," she whispered. "It is," the mirror said. "But she no longer asks to be seen." The Queen's breath came uneven. "Then she has chosen defiance." The mirror was quiet for a long moment. "No," it said at last. "She has chosen absence from judgment." The Queen struck the mirror hard with her palm. The sound rang through the chamber, sharp and final. "Enough," she said. "She cannot exist beyond my sight." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in. Because the mirror, her mirror, could no longer follow. Snow White felt the shift before anyone spoke of it. The forest changed its posture, not in fear, but in release. The air felt lighter, less alert. Birds returned in hesitant bursts of sound. The men noticed it too, exchanging quiet looks as they worked. She stopped searching, Keeper said finally. Snow White sat near the fire, her hands resting loosely in her lap. No, she said softly. She's lost the trail. Watcher nodded. That's worse for her. Snow White closed her eyes briefly. She felt no triumph, only a gentle finality, like the last note of a song fading into silence. That night, Snow White walked alone through the forest, deeper than she ever had before. Not to hide, not to flee, but to witness. She passed trees older than memory, stones half buried beneath centuries of snow and growth. The forest did not watch her now. It recognized her. She stopped at a clearing where the snow lay untouched, smooth as a blank page. Snow White knelt and pressed her bare palm into it, feeling the cold bite cleanly into her skin. She smiled. The cold no longer frightened her. Neither did warmth. She had learned the difference. When she returned, the men greeted her as they always had, not with ceremony, not with deference. With space. In the days that followed, Snow White did not become a leader. She did not become a symbol. She did not gather followers or issue declarations. She lived. She learned the forest seasons, the ways it opened and closed itself. She shared meals that were neither abundant nor scarce. She slept when she was tired and woke when she was ready. Sometimes she spoke of the castle. Sometimes she did not. The queen remained there, watching a mirror that no longer answered the question she feared most. Not who is the fairest, but who am I when no one is watching? The mirror never replied. And Snow White, the girl who could not be measured, was never reflected there again. She existed where mirrors could not reach. In breath and step, in choice and silence, in a life no longer shaped by watching eyes. The forest held her, not as refuge, but as proof. And when winter passed, as it always did, Snow White did not emerge reborn or crowned or claimed. She simply remained, unmeasured, unmirrored, free.